You're sitting on a throne right now, not metaphorically. Literally sitting on a massive chair covered in gold leaf and velvet, elevated above everyone else in the room. There are about 200 people staring at you, waiting for you to speak. Half of them want something from you. A quarter of them are plotting to kill you. The rest are just trying not to accidentally commit treason by looking at you wrong. Your crown weighs about 7 pounds and is giving you a headache. You haven't had a private moment to yourself in 3 days because privacy is for peasants, apparently. Someone is literally watching you sleep to make sure you don't get assassinated. Your dinner last night might have been poisoned. Your food taster is currently very sick, so that's fun. And oh yeah, you're about 19 years old, and your entire formal education consisted of learning to ride a horse, swing a sword, and recite some Latin you don't really understand. Welcome to power in the Middle Ages. Hope you're ready, because there's no employee handbook, no term limits, and absolutely no quitting. You're in this until you die, which statistically might be soon given the whole assassination thing. Here's what's wild about medieval power. Everyone thinks they understand it. Kings had absolute authority. Lords oppressed peasants. The church controlled everything, yada yada. Except that's not how it actually worked. Medieval power was way more complicated, way more fragile, and way more weird than the simplified version we learned in school. It was a constant performance, an endless negotiation, and a daily struggle to maintain the illusion that you were actually in control. Because here's the secret they don't tell you. Having power in the Middle Ages meant everyone wanted something from you, and you needed everyone to maintain your power. Kings needed nobles. Nobles needed knights. Knights needed peasants. Everyone needed the church. It was a massive interconnected web where pulling any thread could unravel the whole thing. And you, sitting on that throne, or managing that estate, or running that city, had to navigate this web every single day without making a fatal mistake. Oh, and the stakes? Absolutely everything. Mess up as a king, and you might spark a civil war. Mess up as a lord, and your peasants might revolt, or your neighboring lord might invade. Mess up as a bishop, and you might get excommunicated or worse. Medieval power came with medieval consequences, which often involved losing your head. Literally, they were really into public executions as a form of political messaging. So buckle up, because we're about to spend the next 20,000 words exploring what it actually meant to have power in the Middle Ages. We're going to talk about kings who weren't really that powerful, nobles who were constantly terrified, church officials navigating impossible political situations, wealthy merchants who had money but not status, and women who wielded massive influence despite theoretically having no power at all. We'll explore how power was performed through elaborate rituals and symbolism, how it was maintained through networks of obligation and favor, how it was challenged by everyone from peasant revolts to papal decrees, how it felt to actually be the person making life and death decisions for thousands of people with limited information and unlimited pressure. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll never look at a medieval king the same way again. You'll understand why being a lord was less living in luxury and more constant anxiety about your neighbors and your own subordinates. You'll see how the church accumulated power that rivaled kings while technically claiming to reject worldly concerns. You'll get why merchants got rich but still couldn't get respect. And you'll appreciate that medieval power was less about absolute authority and more about theatrical performance, combined with strategic negotiation and a whole lot of luck. Now, before we dive in, let's be clear about what we mean by the Middle Ages. We're talking roughly 500 CE to 1500 CE, which is 1,000 years. That's longer than the United States has existed by a factor of 4. Expecting power to work the same way across this entire period is like expecting the Roman Empire and modern America to have identical political systems. They don't, because 1,000 years is a really long time. Also, medieval Europe was huge and diverse. Power worked differently in England versus France, versus the Holy Roman Empire, versus Italy, versus Spain, versus Scandinavia. A king in 800 CE had different powers than a king in 1400 CE. A duke in the chaotic post-Carolingian period had different authority than a duke during the height of centralized monarchy. Context matters, always, but there are patterns, there are commonalities, and there are absolutely some universal truths about what it meant to hold power in this period. So when I make generalizations, remember that there were always exceptions, but the generalizations still tell us something important about medieval political life. All right, enough disclaimers. Let's get into what it actually meant to sit on that throne, wear that crown, and try not to get murdered by your own family members. Welcome to power in the Middle Ages, where everything is complicated and the stakes are literally life and death. Part 1. The Theory versus the Reality of Medieval Kingship. Chapter 1. You're the king. Now what? Congratulations, you're the king. Maybe you inherited the throne from your father. Maybe you seized it in a coup. Maybe you were elected by a group of nobles who all had their own agendas. However you got here, you're now at the top of the feudal pyramid, God's anointed representative on earth, the supreme authority in your kingdom. You have absolute power, except you absolutely don't. And figuring out what power you actually have versus what power you're supposed to have is going to define your entire reign. Let's start with the theory. According to medieval political theology, you're king by divine right. God chose you to rule. Your authority comes from heaven itself. When you were crowned, you were literally anointed with holy oil in a ceremony that made you semi-sacred. You're not quite a priest, but you're definitely not a regular person anymore. The archbishop said some prayers, put a crown on your head, and boom, you're transformed into God's representative on earth. This gives you, in theory, absolute authority. Your word is law. Your decisions are final. Disobeying you is not just treason, it's a sin against God. The political theorists write elaborate treatises about how you're like God on earth, how your kingdom is a reflection of the divine order, how subjects owe you the same obedience they owe to the Almighty. Pretty sweet deal, right? You can basically do whatever you want because you're accountable only to God, and God isn't around to micromanage your daily decisions. Except here's the thing. Everyone else in your kingdom also believes they get their authority from God. Those dukes and counts and barons, they think God put them in their positions too. They were born into nobility, which means God ordained their status just like he ordained yours. The Pope, he definitely thinks his authority comes from God, and he might have some very strong opinions about whether your authority supersedes his when it comes to church matters. Or any matters, really, depending on which pope you're dealing with. Those peasants working the land, they believe God ordained the social order, which means their obligation to work the land is sacred, but so are their customary rights within that system. If you try to violate those rights, you're not just being unfair, you're violating God's plan for society. Good luck explaining why your divine authority trumps their divinely ordained rights. So you've got a situation where everyone claims divine backing for their position, which means conflicts become theological arguments rather than simple power struggles. You can't just say, I'm the king, do what I say. You have to explain why your interpretation of God's will is correct and theirs is wrong. This requires lawyers, theologians, and a whole lot of creative arguing. Now let's talk about what you actually control versus what you're supposed to control. In theory, all the land in the kingdom belongs to you. Every inch of soil is technically royal property that you've graciously allowed others to use. In practice, you directly control maybe 10-20% of it if you're lucky. The rest is held by nobles who swore fealty to you, but who run their own territories with minimal interference from you. These nobles, your vassals, are supposed to provide you with military service, taxes, and political support. Whether they actually do this depends on how much leverage you have over them at any given moment. If you're a strong king with a powerful army and a full treasury, they'll probably comply. If you're weak, young, distracted by foreign wars, or just generally not that intimidating, they'll start ignoring your commands and doing whatever they want. And here's the fun part. You need them more than they need you in most situations. Sure, you're the king, but they control the actual territory, the actual armies, the actual economic resources. You're the symbolic head, but they're the body. If the body decides not to listen to the head is in trouble. You're supposed to be able to raise an army whenever you want. In practice, you have to ask your vassals to provide troops, and they have complex rules about how long they're required to serve. The standard feudal obligation is usually about 40 days of military service per year. That's it, 40 days. If you're fighting a war that lasts longer than that, which, spoiler alert, most wars do, you have to negotiate with your vassals to get them to keep fighting. Maybe you pay them. Maybe you promise them land or titles or other rewards. Maybe you threaten them with punishment if they don't comply. Maybe you try to shame them by questioning their honor and loyalty. Usually you end up doing all of these things simultaneously and hoping something works. And even then, you might have nobles who just pack up and go home after their 40 days, leaving you in the middle of a military campaign with half an army. Oh, and those vassals who do provide troops, the troops are loyal to the vassal, not to you. They're the duke's men or the count's men, not the king's men. So if your vassal decides mid-campaign that he doesn't like how things are going and wants to switch sides, his entire contingent might go with him. You're commanding an army that's actually a coalition of smaller armies, any of which might defect at any moment. It's like herding cats, except the cats are heavily armed and some of them want to kill you. You're supposed to be able to administer justice throughout your kingdom. This is one of your primary functions as king. You're the ultimate judge, the source of law, the person who ensures that justice is done. In theory, any of your subjects can appeal to you for justice, and your decision is final. In practice, most local justice is handled by local lords in their own courts, using local customs that predate you by centuries and might directly contradict the royal law you're trying to enforce. A peasant with a dispute goes to his lord's court. Minor crimes are handled there. Property disputes, inheritance issues, contract disagreements, all handled locally according to local custom. You only get involved in really serious cases, or when someone appeals a local decision to you, or when the dispute involves nobles who are your direct vassals. Even then, your ability to enforce your rulings depends on whether the parties involved actually respect your authority. If a powerful duke ignores your ruling, what are you going to do about it? Raise an army to force compliance. Great idea, except you need that duke's troops to raise an army, so that's awkward. Also, starting a war with one of your own vassals is a great way to encourage other vassals to rebel, because they'll all worry they might be next. So you might issue a ruling, the duke might ignore it, and you might just have to accept that your authority has limits and move on. The smarter move is usually to negotiate. You find a compromise that lets the duke save face while nominally complying with your ruling. Or you trade something. You'll let this slide if he supports you on some other issue. Medieval politics is all about the art of the deal, and you're constantly trading favors and making bargains to maintain the illusion that everyone is following your commands. You're supposed to collect taxes. This should be straightforward. You're the king. You need money to run the kingdom, so people pay you taxes. In practice, medieval taxation is an absolute nightmare of competing jurisdictions, ancient privileges, and outright resistance. First, there's no regular taxation system in most medieval kingdoms, at least not early on. You have revenue from your royal estates, the land you directly control. You have some feudal dues that vassals are supposed to pay. You might have customs duties from trade. But a general tax on everyone in the kingdom, that requires consent. And getting consent means negotiating with nobles and cities who all want something in return for agreeing to be taxed. Some cities have charters guaranteeing freedom from certain taxes. You, or one of your predecessors, granted these charters in exchange for political support, or loans, or military help. Now those cities are exempt, and they will fight you legally and possibly militarily if you try to tax them anyway. They've got lawyers and written documents proving their exemptions, and they will use them. Some nobles have hereditary exemptions from specific taxes. Maybe their ancestor did something heroic for your great-grandfather, and was rewarded with tax exemption. Maybe they just negotiated a good deal at some point. Either way, they're not paying, and they've got documentation to prove they don't have to. The church doesn't pay taxes to you at all. The church is exempt from secular taxation because it's God's institution, and you're just a temporal ruler. In fact, if anything, you're paying taxes to the church through tithes. Now, you might be able to negotiate special payments from the church in exchange for protecting church property or granting other favors, but these are technically voluntary gifts, not taxes, and the church will remind you of this distinction constantly. Try to impose new taxes without getting consent from your nobles in major cities, and you're asking for trouble. Your nobles will resist, claiming you're violating their ancient rights. Cities might close their gates and refuse to cooperate. The church might complain to the Pope, who might then publicly criticize you. You might spark a rebellion. This actually happened repeatedly throughout medieval history. Kings needed money, usually to fight wars. They tried to impose taxes without going through proper channels. Nobles and cities rebelled. The king either backed down and confirmed existing limits on his power, or pushed forward and ended up in a civil war that he might lose. Here's a concrete example. You're Edward the Wern of England in 1297. You're fighting wars in Wales, Scotland, and France simultaneously, which is expensive. You desperately need money. So you try to tax the clergy without papal consent and seize wool exports without getting parliamentary approval. This seems reasonable to you. You're the king, there's a national emergency. Everyone should contribute. What actually happens? The nobles rebel under Roger Bigod, Earl of Norfolk, who basically tells you that if you want to go to France, you can go by yourself. The clergy appeal to Pope Boniface III, who issues a papal bull forbidding clergy from paying taxes to secular rulers without papal permission. You've now got a domestic rebellion and an international diplomatic crisis. You back down. You confirm Magna Carta and other charters limiting your power. You agree not to impose taxes without consent. You're the King of England. You have an army. You have the law on your side theoretically. And you still lose because power in medieval politics isn't about what you're entitled to. It's about what you can actually enforce. Or consider King John of England in 1215. John has been a disaster of a king. He lost most of England's French territories to Philip II of France, earning him the nickname Lackland. He's constantly demanding money from his nobles to fund failed military campaigns. He's got a terrible temper and makes arbitrary decisions. He got into a fight with Pope Innocent III that resulted in England being placed under interdict. Basically, church services stopped throughout the country for 6 years. People couldn't get married in church, couldn't get Christian burials, couldn't receive most sacraments. This made John incredibly unpopular. By 1215, John's nobles have had enough. They rebel, capture London, and literally force John at sword point to sign Magna Carta. This document limits royal power in all sorts of ways. The king can't impose new taxes without noble consent. He can't arrest people arbitrarily. He has to respect church rights and city charters. Legal decisions require due process. This is supposed to be impossible under the divine right theory of kingship. God chose the king to rule. How can mere nobles limit God's anointed? But it happens anyway, because theory and practice are very different things. John signs the document. He later tries to repudiate it, but that's another story. And the balance of power in England permanently shifts. The daily reality of being a medieval king is that you're constantly negotiating, compromising, and managing relationships. You spend way more time on politics than on actually ruling. You're always trying to build coalitions, maintain alliances, reward supporters, punish enemies carefully enough to deter others, but not so harshly that you spark a rebellion. And you spend enormous amounts of time on ceremonial duties that reinforce the image of your power. You preside over court sessions where you sit on your throne and hear petitions. You host elaborate feasts where the seating arrangements communicate political hierarchies. You go on royal progresses, long trips around your kingdom where you show yourself to your subjects, stay at various nobles' estates at their expense, and remind everyone that you exist and you're in charge. You attend church services prominently, usually sitting in a special seat where everyone can see you. This demonstrates your piety and your special relationship with God. You participate in religious ceremonies, sometimes playing active roles that blur the line between secular and sacred authority. You hold tournaments where knights compete in jousting and other martial contests. You preside over these events, award prizes, and bask in the display of military prowess that theoretically supports your rule. Tournaments are partly entertainment, partly military training, and partly political theater, showing off the strength of your kingdom. You might go hunting, which is both recreation and political statement. Hunting is a royal privilege. You own the deer and wild boar in the royal forests, and hunting them without permission is poaching, a serious crime. When you hunt, you're demonstrating your exclusive rights to these resources. You're also showing off your physical prowess and courage, important qualities for a medieval king. All of this is theater. It's performance. You're constantly acting the role of king, using visual and symbolic methods to reinforce your authority, because you can't rely on actual coercive power alone. The crown, the throne, the ceremonies, the hunts, the tournaments, these all communicate that you're special. You're chosen by God. You're naturally at the top of the social hierarchy. But behind the theater, you're making deals constantly. You're granting favors to keep nobles loyal. Sir Robert wants a disputed manor to go to his son-in-law instead of his nephew. You grant the manor to the son-in-law, and now Sir Robert owes you one. The bishop wants royal confirmation of his cathedral's ancient privileges. You confirm them, and now the bishop might support you when you need clerical backing for a controversial policy. You're arranging marriages to build political alliances. Your daughter marries the son of a powerful duke, linking your families and ensuring the duke's loyalty. Your son marries a foreign princess, sealing an alliance with another kingdom. These marriages are diplomatic tools, and your children are the currency. Medieval royal children understood from a young age that their marriages would be arranged for political purposes. You're mediating disputes between powerful vassals to prevent private wars. Two of your earls are fighting over a piece of territory. If you let them resolve it through warfare, you risk a conflict that spirals out of control and draws in other nobles, potentially splitting your kingdom into warring factions. So you intervene, propose a settlement, maybe arbitrate a formal hearing, and try to get both parties to accept a compromise. This is exhausting and often thankless work, but it's essential to maintaining stability. You're writing letters constantly. Letters to other kings about diplomatic matters. Letters to the Pope about church-state relations. Letters to cities confirming their charters or requesting loans. Letters to nobles summoning them to court or asking for military service. Medieval government ran on parchment and ink, and you're at the center of this correspondence network. You're listening to petitioners who want you to solve their problems. Someone claims they've been unjustly dispossessed of their land. Someone wants you to grant them a monopoly on salt trade in a particular region. Someone wants exemption from a tax. Someone wants you to punish a noble who wronged them. You hear dozens or hundreds of these petitions, and you have to decide which ones to grant, which to deny, and which to defer for more information. And through all of this, you're paranoid, constantly, because medieval kings got overthrown, murdered, and deposed with alarming regularity. Richard III of England, killed in battle by Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII. Edward II of England, deposed by his own wife, Isabella, and her lover Roger Mortimer, then probably murdered in Berkeley Castle. The traditional story involves a red-hot poker in a very uncomfortable place, though historians debate whether this actually happened. Richard II of England, deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, imprisoned, and died in captivity under suspicious circumstances. And that's just England. The Holy Roman Empire had emperors deposed by popes. France had kings assassinated. Everywhere you look in medieval Europe, rulers were being violently removed from power. So you have food tasters, Before you eat anything, someone else eats it first and waits to see if they get sick or die. If they survive, the food is probably safe. This is degrading for the taster and anxiety-inducing for you, but it's necessary because poison is a real threat. Rivals, ambitious family members, foreign agents, any of them might try to kill you with poisoned wine or food. You surround yourself with guards. You have bodyguards who stay close to you at all times. You have guards outside your bedchamber. You have guards throughout your palace. You trust these guards with your life, but you also worry about whether they're actually loyal or whether someone has bribed them to look the other way at the crucial moment. You keep your family close, but not too close. Your brothers, uncles, and male cousins are potential rivals for the throne. If they're ambitious, they might try to overthrow you. So you give them positions and honors to keep them happy, but you watch them carefully. You might require them to live at court where you can keep an eye on them. You might marry them off to loyal nobles who will keep them occupied and report any suspicious activity. Your sons are a particular problem. You need a male heir to continue your dynasty, but once your heir is old enough, he becomes an alternative power center. Ambitious nobles who don't like you might start clustering around your heir, preparing for the succession. Your heir might get impatient and try to seize power before you die. There are multiple cases of medieval fathers and sons going to war against each other. Henry II of England spent the last years of his life fighting his own sons, who rebelled against him repeatedly with support from their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and from the King of France. Henry's sons, Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, all turned against him at various points. The stress probably contributed to Henry's death, after which Richard succeeded him as Richard the First. So you are simultaneously trying to prepare your heir to rule effectively and trying to prevent him from getting too powerful too soon. You give him responsibilities and titles to train him, but you keep ultimate authority in your own hands. It's a delicate balance, and many medieval kings failed to manage it successfully. You also have to manage your own household, which is massive and politically significant. Your court might include hundreds of people. You've got family members, nobles who live at court to be near the center of power, clergy who serve as advisors and administrators, officials who run various government departments, servants who handle daily tasks, guards, entertainers, craftsmen. It's like a small city that moves with you. Every position in this household hierarchy is political. Who gets to serve you at dinner? That's a coveted honor because proximity to the king means influence. Who holds which offices? Chamberlain, steward, marshal, chancellor. These positions come with authority, income, and prestige. Appointment to these roles is a political decision that you use to reward supporters and build alliances. The chamberlain controls access to your private chambers and manages your personal finances. The steward oversees your household and estates. The marshal commands your military household and organizes ceremonies. The chancellor handles your correspondence and maintains your seal, which is used to authenticate official documents. These aren't ceremonial positions, they're real power, and who holds them matters enormously. People are constantly competing for these positions and for your favor. Nobles want their sons to serve as pages or squires in your household because it's educational and creates connections. Everyone wants to be invited to your table, to hunt with you, to be included in your inner circle. You're surrounded by people who want something from you, and you have to figure out who actually supports you versus who's just using you for their own advancement. Let's talk about what a typical day in your life actually looks like, because the mundane reality of medieval kingship is different from the grand image. You wake up in the morning, probably not well rested because medieval beds weren't great, and you're stressed about everything. Your chamberlains enter and help you get dressed. This is ceremonial. You probably could dress yourself, but having nobles help you dress emphasizes your status. What you wear matters. Different colored robes and different amounts of ornamentation communicate different messages. Today you might wear crimson silk with gold embroidery because you're receiving a foreign ambassador and need to look impressive. You attend mass in your royal chapel. This is non-negotiable. You're a Christian king, and everyone needs to see that you're pious and devoted to God. The chaplain might be your confessor, someone you trust with your private thoughts and concerns. Religion isn't just political theater. You probably actually believe in this stuff. Medieval people took religion seriously, and being king doesn't exempt you from religious obligations. If anything, you're held to a higher standard. After Mass, you hold court. This is where petitioners present their requests. You're sitting on your throne, elevated above everyone else, while people approach and bow and present their cases. Some are asking for favors, grants of land, confirmation of privileges, pardons for crimes. Some are presenting legal disputes for you to resolve. Some are simply paying their respects. You don't decide these matters on the spot, usually. You have advisors who've reviewed the petitions beforehand. Your chancellor knows which ones are routine approvals and which need careful consideration. You might refer complex legal matters to judges or council committees, but you have to at least appear to consider each petition personally, because people need to feel like they've had access to royal justice. Then you meet with your council. This is your inner circle of advisors, high-ranking nobles, clergy, and officials who help you actually run the kingdom. You discuss current issues. Maybe there's a border dispute with a neighboring kingdom that needs diplomatic attention. Maybe tax revenues are lower than expected, and you need to figure out why. Maybe there are reports of banditry on major roads, and you need to do something about it. These council meetings are where real decisions get made, but they're also political negotiations. Your counselors have their own agendas. The archbishop wants church interests protected. The marshal wants more military spending. The chancellor wants more money for administration. You have to balance these competing demands while maintaining everyone's loyalty. Midday brings dinner, which is a massive public event. You're eating in the Great Hall with 100 or more people present. The seating arrangement is carefully planned to reflect social hierarchy. You sit at the high table on a raised platform. Your family and most important nobles sit near you. Everyone else is arranged by rank and status. What people are served matters. You get the best food, multiple courses of meat, fish, elaborate dishes with expensive spices. Those near you get good food. Those farther away get simpler fare. The inequality is intentional. It visually demonstrates the social hierarchy. Everyone can see that proximity to the king means better treatment. You're not really relaxing during this meal. You're working. You're chatting with the nobles near you, which is informal diplomacy. You're watching everyone, noting who sits with whom, who seems friendly or hostile toward each other. You might call someone over to discuss something privately. You're performing kingship throughout this meal, demonstrating your power through conspicuous consumption and careful management of social dynamics. The afternoon might bring more administrative work. You're signing documents, charters granting privileges, writs commanding officials to take specific actions, safe conducts for travelers. Medieval government generated endless paperwork, and much of it required royal approval. You probably don't read every word. Your clerks prepare these documents, and you trust them to be accurate, but you have to review and approve them, or you might go hunting. This sounds like recreation, but it's political. Hunting is a royal privilege, and exercising that privilege demonstrates your power. You're also bonding with the nobles who hunt with you. Shared experiences build relationships, and you need those relationships to maintain political support. Plus, hunting tests courage and skill, masculine qualities that medieval kings were expected to demonstrate. Or you might hold a tournament. Knights compete in jousting matches while you watch from a prominent seat. You award prizes to the winners. This serves multiple purposes. It provides military training, it entertains your court, and it lets you identify skilled warriors who might be useful in actual warfare. It's also spectacular theater that attracts crowds and demonstrates the power and splendor of your reign. Evening brings more ceremonial duties. Maybe there's an elaborate feast with entertainment, musicians, jugglers, perhaps a troupe of actors. Maybe you're hosting important visitors and need to impress them with your hospitality. Maybe you're holding a ball where nobles dance and socialize. All of this requires your presence and participation. Eventually, you retire to your chambers. Your chamberlains help you undress, which again is ceremonial and political. You might have a final meeting with your closest advisors to discuss sensitive matters you don't want discussed publicly. Then you sleep, surrounded by guards, while tomorrow's problems wait for you. And tomorrow you do it all again. And the day after that. Being king is exhausting, relentless, and way more complicated than the simple sit on throne, issue commands, everyone obeys model that people imagine. The gap between theoretical absolute power and practical limited authority defines medieval kingship. On paper, you're supposed to be all-powerful. God chose you. Your word is law. Everyone must obey. But in practice, you're just the most powerful player in a complex game where everyone has their own power base and their own interests. Your authority depends on your ability to manage relationships, build coalitions, and maintain the support of key power brokers. Lose that support, and your theoretical absolute power evaporates. Kings who forgot this and tried to actually exercise absolute authority usually ended up deposed or dead. Managing this gap, projecting the image of absolute authority while actually negotiating and compromising constantly, is what medieval kingship is really about. You have to appear powerful even when you're weak. You have to make your commands seem inevitable, even when they're actually negotiated compromises. You have to punish disobedience to maintain credibility, but not so harshly that you spark rebellion. It's a constant balancing act, and the penalties for failing are severe. Get it right, and you might reign successfully for decades and be remembered as a great king. Get it wrong, and you might be dead within a year, your crown on someone else's head, your name remembered as a cautionary tale. And here's the kicker. You can't admit any of this publicly. You have to maintain the fiction that you're in complete control, that your authority is absolute, that everyone obeys you willingly and immediately. Any sign of weakness gets exploited immediately. Any admission that you're not actually that powerful encourages challengers. Every action you take, every word you speak, has to reinforce the image of royal power, even while you privately know that your actual power is limited and fragile. You're performing a role, and you can never break character. Not in public, not to nobles, not even to most of your family. The mask of kingship must always be in place, showing confident authority even when you're terrified or uncertain. Welcome to the throne. It's magnificent, powerful, and utterly terrifying. Try not to get overthrown before we move on to talking about what it's like to be a noble, trying to manage your own little kingdom while simultaneously dealing with this king who keeps demanding things from you. This is medieval power. It's not what you thought it was, is it? Chapter 2. Life as a noble. Power without the crown. Okay, so being king sounds exhausting and terrifying. But what if you're not the king? What if you're a duke, an earl, a count, a baron, one of the nobles who theoretically serves the king, but actually runs a significant chunk of territory with considerable autonomy? Surely that's better, right? You've got power without the ultimate responsibility. You've got wealth and status. You control land, collect taxes, command armies. Living the dream, right? Wrong, so incredibly wrong. Being a medieval noble is like being middle management in the most dysfunctional corporation imaginable. Except instead of getting fired if you screw up, you might get executed or have your lands confiscated or find yourself in the middle of a war. You've got all the stress of power with none of the security, and you're constantly being squeezed from above and below. Let's paint the picture. You're a duke, not just any noble. You're at the top of the noble hierarchy below the king. You control a duchy, which might be a quarter of the kingdom or more. You've got castles, estates, thousands of vassals who owe you service, armies of knights, towns that pay you taxes. On paper, you're incredibly powerful. In practice, you're stuck in an impossible position. From above, the king is constantly demanding things from you. Military service when he goes to war. Money when he needs to fund campaigns or build projects. Political support when he's implementing unpopular policies. Attendance at court, which means traveling to wherever the king is holding court, at your expense, and spending weeks or months away from your own lands. You're supposed to drop everything whenever the king summons you, because you're his vassal, and that's how feudalism works. But here's the problem. You have your own territories to manage. While you're off attending the king or fighting his wars, who's running your duchy? You've got subordinate nobles who manage various parts of your territory, but they've got their own agendas. Leave them unsupervised too long, and they might start acting independently, ignoring your authority, making deals with each other that cut you out. You might return from 6 months of military service to find that your own vassals have formed alliances against you. From below, you've got vassals, knights, towns, and peasants, all of whom have their own interests and demands. Your vassals want you to protect them from threats, both external, neighboring nobles, bandits, foreign invaders, and internal, disputes with other vassals. They want you to grant them favors, confirm their privileges, settle their disputes fairly. If they don't think you're holding up your end of the feudal bargain, they might rebel or transfer their loyalty to another lord. Your knights expect to be rewarded for their service. They want land grants, they want positions in your household, they want their sons to marry into good families. If you don't keep them happy, they might offer their services to someone else. Medieval knights were often surprisingly mobile. They'd switch employers if someone offered better terms. Your towns want commercial privileges, protection from arbitrary taxation, and fair treatment in legal disputes. Towns have money, which you need, but they also have walls and militias, which means they can resist if you push them too hard. The relationship between nobles and towns is constantly negotiated, with both sides trying to maximize their advantages. Your peasants, whom everyone assumes are powerless, actually have significant leverage through collective action. If you abuse them too badly, excessive taxation, violation of customary rights, arbitrary justice, they might flee to another lord's territory or to towns. And if they get desperate enough, they might revolt. Peasant revolts are rare but devastating when they happen. You really don't want to deal with thousands of angry peasants with agricultural tools converted into weapons, so you're trapped in the middle. The king wants more from you than you can comfortably provide. Your subordinates want more from you than you can comfortably grant. You're constantly balancing competing demands and trying to keep everyone happy enough that they don't rebel or abandon you. And then there are your fellow nobles, who are simultaneously your peers, your allies, and your mortal enemies. Other dukes and counts are theoretically your equals in status, all vassals of the same king. In practice, you're competing with them for royal favor, for territory, for prestige. If you seem weak, they might attack you and try to seize some of your lands. If you seem too strong, they might form alliances against you to cut you down to size. Medieval nobles lived in a state of constant low-level warfare with their neighbors. These weren't always formal wars declared by kings. They were private conflicts, over disputed territories, feuds over insults or injuries, opportunistic raids to seize resources. The king theoretically had authority to stop these private wars, but in practice, he often couldn't or didn't. So you had to be prepared to defend your lands militarily at any moment. This means maintaining a military force, which is expensive. You need knights, which means you need to grant them land, reducing your own direct holdings, or pay them salaries, draining your treasury. You need castles, which cost a fortune to build and maintain. You need weapons, armor, horses, all of which are expensive and require constant replacement and repair. Let's talk about castles specifically, because they're central to noble power. Your castle isn't just a residence. It's a military installation, an administrative center, a symbol of your authority, and a prison for enemies. Building a good castle costs several years' worth of your total income. Maintaining it requires constant expenditure on repairs, garrison wages, and supplies. But you need that castle. It's your security. If someone attacks you, you retreat to your castle and wait for them to give up, or for your allies to come help. Castles are incredibly defensible. A small force in a well-built castle can hold off a much larger attacking army for months. This is why medieval warfare often consisted of long sieges rather than open battles. Your castle is also where you demonstrate your power and wealth. The great hall where you host feasts needs to be impressive. The furnishings need to show that you're prosperous. When you host other nobles or royal officials, they're evaluating your status partly based on the quality of your castle and hospitality. So you spend money on tapestries, furniture, silverware, all the trappings of noble life. You also need to maintain a household staff. A duke might have hundreds of people in his household. Family members, knights, squires, pages, clergy, your personal, chaplains, administrators, people who manage your estates and keep records, servants of all types. All these people need to be fed, clothed, housed, and often paid. Your household is a massive ongoing expense. And let's talk about those estates you control. In theory, your lands generate income that funds all this expenditure. In practice, managing estates is complicated and often frustrating. Medieval agriculture was not highly productive. Most of what peasants grew went to feeding themselves. The surplus they produced, which you claimed as rent or taxes, might not be that large, especially in bad years. You've got administrators managing your various estates, but they might be corrupt or incompetent. They might be skimming off the top, reporting lower revenues than what's actually collected, and pocketing the difference. You can't personally oversee every estate because you've got too many spread across too much territory. So you're relying on administrators who might be robbing you, and there's only so much you can do about it. Weather and disease affect your income unpredictably. A drought means poor harvests, which means less rent from your peasants. An epidemic might kill off livestock, or even peasants, reducing your labor force and productivity. You have almost no control over these variables, but they directly impact your wealth, and therefore your power. Then there are your expenses beyond basic maintenance. You've got social obligations that cost money. When your daughter gets married, you need to provide a dowry, which might be a huge chunk of land or money. When your son is knighted, you're expected to throw a big ceremony and feast. When important visitors come, you need to host them lavishly. When there's a tournament, you might participate or sponsor it, both of which cost money. You're also expected to be generous. Noble status comes with expectations of largesse, giving gifts, providing patronage to artists and scholars, supporting churches and monasteries, helping vassals who fall on hard times. A noble who's stingy gets criticized and loses respect, but being generous drains your resources. It's another impossible balance. And if the king demands a special tax or asks for a loan, you can't really refuse without risking his displeasure. Kings regularly squeezed their nobles for money, and nobles had to comply or face consequences. But this meant that unpredictable royal demands could wreck your financial planning. So you're constantly anxious about money. You're wealthy by any objective measure. You live in a castle, you eat well, you wear expensive clothes. But you're also spending enormous amounts maintaining your power and status, and your income is uncertain. Many nobles were chronically in debt, borrowing from merchants or monasteries and struggling to repay. Now let's talk about succession, which is where noble anxiety reaches peak levels. You need a male heir to inherit your titles and lands. If you don't have a son, your lands might get divided among daughters, or revert to the king, or become disputed among various relatives. So you need to produce male heirs. But having heirs creates new problems. Multiple sons mean you need to provide for all of them. The eldest inherits your primary title and lands, but younger sons need something too. You might grant them smaller estates, which reduces your direct holdings. You might arrange marriages for them to heiresses, expanding your family's influence, but also creating potential rivals to your eldest son. And once you have an adult heir, the same problems kings face apply to you. Your heir might get impatient and try to seize power. He might form alliances with your enemies. Nobles who dislike you might start supporting your heir instead, preparing for the succession. You need your heir to be capable enough to eventually rule, but not so powerful that he becomes a threat while you're still alive. Succession disputes were common and devastating. When a noble died and multiple people claimed to be the rightful heir, it could trigger wars that lasted for years. Even if the succession was clear legally, there might be relatives who felt they deserved something and were willing to fight for it. Your death could plunge your territories into chaos, which means everything you build could be destroyed by the next generation's conflicts. The daily life of a noble is surprisingly similar to a king's life, just on a smaller scale. You hold court, you hear petitions, you settle disputes, you manage your household, which is a complex political entity with its own hierarchies and conflicts. You host feasts and maintain social relationships with other nobles. You go to church regularly because piety is expected. You hunt, you participate in tournaments, you train for warfare. But unlike the king, you also have to travel frequently. Your lands are scattered across a wide territory. You need to visit different estates, to oversee them personally, to settle disputes, to show yourself to your vassals and subjects. Medieval government required personal presence. You couldn't effectively rule through letters alone. So you spent a lot of time traveling from castle to castle, bringing your household with you. This traveling was expensive and uncomfortable. Medieval roads were terrible. You're riding horses or traveling in carts over muddy, rutted paths. In winter, it's freezing. In summer, it's sweltering. You might spend weeks on the road moving between estates. And while you're traveling, you're vulnerable to bandits or to enemies who might ambush you. You also travel to attend the king's court, which you're required to do periodically. This means leaving your own lands, traveling to wherever the king is, which might be far away, staying for weeks or months, and then traveling back. The king's court is politically important. It's where you maintain your relationship with the king, where you network with other nobles, where major decisions get made. But it's also exhausting and expensive. When you're at the king's court, you're performing constantly. You need to dress impressively to show your status. You need to bring an entourage to demonstrate your importance. You need to give gifts and host dinners for other nobles. You're competing with other nobles for the king's attention and favor. It's all theater and politics. And if you screw up, if you offend someone important or fail to show adequate respect, it can have serious consequences. Let's talk about the relationships between nobles, because this is where things get really complicated. On one level, you're all part of the same social class. You intermarry, you socialize, you share a common culture and values. You speak the same language, often literally French, even in England, for much of the medieval period. You participate in the same ceremonies and rituals. You're bound by the same code of chivalry and honor. On another level, you're constantly competing and often actively hostile. Territory is limited. Prestige is relative. You can only be more important than other nobles if they're less important. Resources are scarce, so while you might be friendly with another duke at court, you might also be preparing to seize his lands if an opportunity arises. Medieval noble families had feuds that lasted for generations, some insult or injury from decades ago. Maybe your grandfather killed his grandfather in battle, or your family seized some disputed territory. Creates ongoing hostility. These feuds were taken seriously. You inherited your ancestors' enemies along with their lands. You were expected to continue feuds and seek revenge for old grievances. At the same time, you formed alliances through marriage. Your daughter marries his son, linking your families. Now you're theoretically allies, even if you hate each other personally. But these marriage alliances were fragile. If circumstances changed, the alliance might break, or the marriage might create new conflicts. If your son-in-law mistreats your daughter, do you intervene? If you do, you might restart a feud. If you don't, you look weak. Then there's the concept of honor, which governed noble behavior in complex ways. Your honor and your family's honor were paramount. Insults had to be answered. Injuries had to be avenged. If someone questioned your courage, your loyalty, or your integrity, you needed to respond forcefully or lose respect. This led to duels and private warfare over things that seemed trivial to modern people. Someone made a snide comment about your family. That's a challenge to your honor, and you might literally go to war over it. Someone refused to give precedence to you at a ceremony. Insult to your status, potential cause for violence. Kings tried to regulate this by establishing formal procedures for resolving disputes and by forbidding private warfare. but enforcement was inconsistent. Nobles often ignored prohibitions on private warfare and fought each other anyway. The king might intervene if the conflict got too disruptive, but often he just let nobles sort out their own problems. Women in noble families deserve special attention because their situation was unique. Noble women theoretically had no formal power. Medieval society was patriarchal, and political authority was supposed to rest with men. In practice, noble women often wielded considerable power, especially when their husbands or fathers were absent. If you're a duke away at war or at the king's court, your wife might be managing your estates. She's making administrative decisions, settling disputes, even commanding castle defenses if enemies attack. Many noble women were highly educated and politically astute. They understood how power worked, and they exercised it effectively, even if officially the power belonged to their husbands. Widows had even more power. If your husband died and your son was underage, you might serve as regent, effectively ruling the duchy until your son came of age. Some noble women never gave up this power willingly, creating conflicts with their sons when the sons wanted to take control. Marriages were political arrangements, but they were also personal relationships that lasted decades. A strong marriage between partners who worked together effectively could strengthen a noble house significantly. A weak or hostile marriage could weaken it, and noble women, despite their theoretical lack of power, could make or break their husbands' political fortunes through their intelligence, connections, and political skills. Now let's address the elephant in the room. What happens when a noble rebels against the king? This happened regularly throughout the Middle Ages, so it's not a hypothetical question. Maybe the king demanded too much. Maybe he violated your rights. Maybe he seized some of your lands unjustly. Maybe you just think you'd be a better king than he is. For whatever reason, you decide to rebel. This is an incredibly risky decision. If you win, you might force the king to back down, or you might even overthrow him and seize the throne yourself. If you lose everything. Your lands, your titles, probably your life. Rebellion is all or nothing. To have any chance of success, you need allies. You can't rebel alone against a king. So you form a coalition of nobles who all have grievances. You promise each other mutual support. You make plans to coordinate military action. You might even seek foreign backing. Another king who's happy to support your rebellion because it weakens his rival. Then you have to actually fight, which is terrifying. Medieval warfare was brutal. Battles were chaotic, bloody affairs where you could easily die, even if your side won. Sieges were long and exhausting, with disease often killing more people than actual combat. And even if you're not personally fighting on the front lines, your lands might be devastated by the conflict. If you win some early victories, other nobles might join your rebellion, sensing that the king is weak. If you lose early, your allies might abandon you, trying to make peace with the king before they get punished too severely. Rebellions often succeeded or failed based on momentum and perception as much as actual military strength. And let's say you win. You force the king to grant concessions. Great. Except now, you've set a precedent that the king can be challenged. Other nobles might decide to try the same thing. The king certainly hasn't forgotten that you rebelled, and he'll be looking for opportunities to punish you once he's stronger. Winning a rebellion doesn't bring stability. It often leads to ongoing conflict. Or let's say you lose. The king captures you. If you're lucky, you might be imprisoned and eventually ransomed or pardoned. If you're unlucky, you're executed as a traitor, your lands are confiscated, and your family is disgraced. The king might execute your accomplices too, eliminating a whole generation of noble leadership. Your rebellion might end with your head on a spike as a warning to others. This is the constant calculation nobles had to make. When to comply with the king versus when to resist. Push back too little, and you're seen as weak, and the king will exploit you. Push back too hard, and you risk rebellion and all its consequences. The successful nobles were the ones who calibrated this balance carefully, resisting enough to maintain their autonomy, but not so much that they provoked royal retaliation. Being a medieval noble meant living with constant uncertainty and anxiety. Your power was real, but fragile. Your wealth was substantial, but never secure. Your status was high, but always potentially subject to challenge. You were constantly managing relationships, making calculations, trying to navigate between competing demands and threats. And you couldn't show weakness or fear. Just like the king, you had to maintain a performance of confidence and authority. You had to act as if you were in complete control, even when you were terrified that everything might collapse. You had to project power to maintain power. The castle you lived in, the clothes you wore, the feasts you hosted, the ceremonies you participated in, all of this was theater designed to reinforce your status. But unlike modern theater, the consequences of a bad performance were real and severe. Fail to maintain your image, and you might lose everything. So no, being a medieval noble was not easy or comfortable, despite the wealth and status. It was a high-wire act, performed over a very long drop, and you could never afford to slip. Chapter 3. The Church, Spiritual Authority, meets temporal power. All right, let's talk about the most complicated power structure in medieval Europe. The Church, and when I say complicated, I mean absolutely Byzantine in its complexity. The medieval Church was simultaneously a spiritual institution focused on salvation, a massive economic enterprise controlling enormous wealth, a political power that could make or break kings, an educational and cultural institution, and a legal system with its own courts and laws. Trying to understand church power is like trying to understand a corporation, a government, a university, and a religion all smooshed together into one institution. Let's say you're a bishop. Not the Pope, we'll get to him in a minute, but a regular bishop running a diocese. Maybe you're the Bishop of Paris, or Canterbury, or Cologne, or any of the hundreds of bishoprics across medieval Europe. What does your power actually look like? On the spiritual level, you have authority that even kings don't have. You can excommunicate people, cutting them off from the sacraments, and therefore, medieval people believed, damning their souls to hell. You can place entire territories under interdict, basically shutting down church services across a wide area. You can declare certain practices heretical. You control access to salvation, which, in a deeply religious society, means you control something more valuable than any worldly power. This spiritual authority translates into real political power. If you threaten to excommunicate a king, that's not just a religious penalty, it's a political crisis. His subjects might feel released from their obligations to him. Other Christian rulers might refuse to ally with an excommunicated king. The king's legitimacy, which rests partly on his status as a good Christian, is undermined. So kings generally tried very hard not to get excommunicated. But here's where it gets complicated. You're also a temporal lord. Your diocese includes lands, estates, towns. These lands generate revenue just like a noble's lands do. You collect rents and taxes from your tenants. You have vassals who owe you military service. You might have your own knights, and even your own small army. Some bishops were major territorial lords, controlling significant amounts of land and wealth. This creates an immediate conflict of interest. As a spiritual leader, you're supposed to be focused on souls, on religious matters, on living a holy life in service to God. As a temporal lord, you're focused on money, political alliances, military strength, and protecting your territories. These two roles don't always align well. Let's get concrete. You're the Bishop of Durham in England. Durham is a palatinate, which means you have special rights normally reserved for the king. You have your own courts, your own administration, your own military forces. You're basically running a semi-independent state within the kingdom, answering to the king, but with enormous autonomy. This is because Durham is on the Scottish border, and you're responsible for defending northern England from Scottish raids. So on Sunday, you're celebrating Mass, preaching about humility, and turning the other cheek, and focusing on the next life, rather than worldly concerns. On Monday, you're commanding troops, negotiating with the king about military obligations, and collecting taxes to fund castle construction. The contradiction is stark, but it's just how medieval bishops operated. You're appointed to your position through a process that's theoretically spiritual, but actually deeply political. In theory, bishops should be chosen by their cathedral chapters, the groups of clergy attached to cathedrals, based on their piety and suitability for spiritual leadership. In practice, kings and popes both try to influence these appointments because bishops are too important to leave to chance. If you are a bishop in England, the king probably had significant input into your appointment. He wants bishops who are loyal to him, who will support his policies, who will provide military and financial help when needed. He might nominate candidates or pressure the cathedral chapter to elect his preferred choice. The pope might also weigh in, either supporting or opposing the king's candidate based on papal political interests. So you might owe your position to royal favor, which creates obligations. The king expects loyalty and support, but you also have obligations to the pope, who is theoretically your supreme authority in spiritual matters. And you have obligations to your cathedral chapter and to the clergy of your diocese, who expect you to protect church interests and rights. When these obligations conflict, and they frequently do, you're in an impossible position. The king wants you to pay a tax to fund a war. The pope has forbidden bishops from paying taxes to secular rulers without papal permission. What do? If you pay the tax, you're defying the pope. If you refuse, you're defying the king. Either way, you're making a powerful enemy. Or consider this scenario. The king wants to appoint his illegitimate son to a position in your diocese. This son is barely literate, has no religious vocation whatsoever, and is clearly unsuitable for church office. But the king wants to provide for his son, and giving him a lucrative church position is convenient. Do you comply and compromise your spiritual integrity? Or do you refuse and risk the king's anger? These weren't hypothetical dilemmas. Medieval bishops faced these choices constantly. Some became essentially royal officials who happened to wear religious vestments. Others tried to maintain spiritual independence and ended up in conflict with secular authorities. Most tried to navigate between these extremes, compromising where necessary, but drawing lines on issues they considered crucial. Your relationship with the Pope is particularly interesting. In theory, the Pope is your superior in all spiritual matters, and you owe him obedience. In practice, the Pope is far away, in Rome or sometimes in Avignon in southern France, and has limited ability to enforce his commands. Papal letters might take months to arrive. Papal legatees might visit occasionally to check on things, but you can often safely ignore papal directives if you're careful about it. But you can't ignore the Pope entirely. He can remove you from office if he's really determined. He can transfer you to a different, less prestigious diocese. He can excommunicate you. And perhaps most importantly, the Pope controls access to dispensations and privileges that you might need. Want to establish a new monastery in your diocese? You need papal approval. Want to resolve a complex legal case involving church law? You might need to appeal to Rome. So you cultivate a relationship with the Pope, sending letters and gifts, supporting papal policies when it doesn't cost you too much, and generally trying to stay in good standing. But you also maintain your independence when necessary, relying on distance and the slowness of medieval communication to do what you think is best for your diocese without waiting for papal permission. Now let's talk about money, because church wealth was staggering. The church was probably the largest landholder in medieval Europe. Bishoprics, monasteries, abbeys, and other church institutions owned enormous estates. These estates generated massive income through rents, taxes, and agricultural production. As a bishop, you control this wealth, at least in your diocese. You're using it partly for spiritual purposes, maintaining cathedrals, supporting clergy, funding charitable works, but you're also using it for very worldly purposes. You're living in a palace, wearing expensive vestments, hosting elaborate feasts. You're maintaining a household that might include dozens or hundreds of people. You're funding political activities and military expenses. Critics pointed out the contradiction between Jesus' teachings about poverty and the church's enormous wealth. Religious reformers throughout the medieval period condemned church luxury and called for a return to apostolic poverty. Some bishops took these criticisms seriously and tried to live more simply. Others basically ignored them and continued living like princes. The wealth also created corruption. Church positions were valuable because they came with income. This led to simony, buying and selling church offices. A wealthy family might pay to get their son appointed as a bishop, knowing that the income from the bishopric would more than repay the investment. The church officially condemned simony, but it happened constantly anyway. There was also pluralism, holding multiple church positions simultaneously. A clever and ambitious cleric might accumulate several positions, drawing income from all of them, even though he could only personally perform the duties of one. This was technically illegal, but widely practiced, especially among the well-connected. Your legal authority as a bishop is another major source of power. The church had its own court system, separate from secular courts. Church courts handled cases involving clergy, cases involving religious matters, marriage, wills, oaths, and cases involving moral issues. The jurisdiction was broad and often disputed with secular authorities. If you're accused of a crime and you're clergy, or even if you can demonstrate some connection to the church, you could claim benefit of clergy and demand to be tried in church courts rather than secular courts. Church courts couldn't impose capital punishment, so this was a significant advantage. Secular authorities hated this because it meant clergy literally got away with murder sometimes. As a bishop, you preside over church courts in your diocese. You're making legal decisions that affect thousands of people. You're issuing marriage annulments, which might have major political consequences if the people involved are nobles. You're punishing clergy who violate church law. You're resolving disputes about wills and inheritances. This is real power that directly affects people's lives. The relationship between church courts and secular courts was constantly contested. Kings wanted to limit church court jurisdiction because it reduced royal authority. The church wanted to expand jurisdiction because it brought in revenue, court fees, and power. This tension led to major conflicts throughout the medieval period, including the famous dispute between Henry II of England and Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, which ended with Becket's murder in his own cathedral. Let's talk about that case specifically because it illustrates the conflicts bishops faced. Becket was Henry II's friend and chancellor before becoming archbishop. Henry appointed him thinking Becket would be a loyal supporter who would help Henry control the church in England. But once Becket became archbishop, he transformed into a staunch defender of church rights and privileges. The conflict came to a head over benefit of clergy. Henry wanted clergy accused of crimes to be tried in secular courts. Becket insisted on church court jurisdiction. Neither would back down. The dispute escalated. Becket fled to France. Henry made threatening statements about Becket, and 4 of Henry's knights took this as authorization to murder the archbishop. Becket's murder was a public relations disaster for Henry. Killing an archbishop in his own cathedral was about as bad as it gets. Becket became a martyr and saint almost immediately. Henry had to do public penance, walking barefoot to Becket's tomb and allowing himself to be whipped by monks. The church's position on benefit of clergy was strengthened rather than weakened. The lesson for bishops was clear. Standing up to kings could get you killed, but it could also make you a saint. Whether that trade-off was worth it probably depended on your personal level of commitment to spiritual principles versus your desire to keep living. As a bishop, you also have educational responsibilities. Cathedrals often had schools attached to them, training future clergy. Universities grew out of cathedral schools. You're responsible for ensuring that clergy in your diocese are adequately educated, which in practice means you're running an educational system. This gives you cultural power. You control access to literacy and learning in a largely illiterate society. The clergy you train become administrators, lawyers, teachers, and advisors to secular rulers. They staff the bureaucracies that run medieval governments. By controlling their education, you shape the intellectual culture of your entire society. Monasteries and abbeys in your diocese are another source of both power and problems. These institutions are theoretically under your authority as bishop, but in practice, many monasteries have exemptions from episcopal control. They answer directly to the Pope or to the head of their religious order. This means you have less control over them than you'd like. But monasteries are important. They're centers of learning and literacy. They preserve books and learning. They provide hospitality to travelers. They pray for the souls of the dead, which is considered crucial for salvation. And they control significant lands and wealth. If you can work cooperatively with monasteries in your diocese, it strengthens your position. If you're in conflict with them, it weakens you. You also have to deal with religious enthusiasm and heresy. Throughout the medieval period, there were movements that challenged church authority or advocated different interpretations of Christianity. As a bishop, you're responsible for identifying and suppressing heresy in your diocese. This is complicated because the line between acceptable religious devotion and unacceptable heresy isn't always clear. Someone preaching about the need for church reform might be a legitimate critic or a dangerous heretic. Someone having mystical visions might be a saint or a madwoman. You have to make judgment calls, and these calls have serious consequences. People could be burned at the stake for heresy. The politics of heresy accusations were also complex. Sometimes heresy charges were used to attack political enemies. Accuse someone of heresy, and even if the charges are false, you've damaged their reputation and created problems for them. This made heresy accusations a political weapon, as much as a spiritual concern. Your daily life as a bishop mixes spiritual and administrative duties in ways that would seem bizarre to modern people. You might celebrate Mass in the morning, then spend the afternoon in legal courts hearing cases, then evening meeting with the king's representatives about a political dispute. You're simultaneously a priest, a judge, a landlord, a political operator, and an administrator. You have to be educated. You need to understand theology, canon law, church law, and probably civil law as well. You need to be politically astute, navigating relationships with the Pope, the king, nobles, other bishops, and your own clergy. You need administrative skills to manage your estates and households. And ideally, you should actually be personally religious and committed to your spiritual responsibilities, though not all bishops met this standard. The best bishops managed to balance all these competing demands. They were genuinely pious and focused on spiritual leadership, but also politically savvy enough to protect church interests. They were wealthy and powerful, but also charitable and concerned with caring for the poor. They maintained good relationships with the secular authorities while defending church independence. These bishops were often remembered as saints and exemplary leaders. The worst bishops were essentially corrupt politicians in religious clothing. They bought their positions, ignored their spiritual duties, lived lives of luxury and debauchery, and used church authority purely for personal gain. They gave the medieval church its reputation for corruption and helped fuel the Protestant Reformation that eventually broke church unity. Most bishops fell somewhere in between, trying to be good spiritual leaders, while also dealing with the practical realities of power, wealth, and politics. They made compromises, sometimes held their spiritual principles, sometimes bent them when necessary. They were human beings in impossible situations, trying to serve God while also surviving in a brutal political environment. Being a medieval bishop meant having enormous power, spiritual authority that even kings feared, temporal authority over significant territories, legal authority through church courts, cultural authority through educational institutions, and economic power from massive land holdings. But it also meant being pulled in multiple directions by competing obligations, facing constant moral dilemmas about how to use that power, and risking everything from your soul to your physical safety depending on the choices you made. It was power, absolutely, but it was power that came with massive responsibility and massive complications. Welcome to the medieval church, where nothing is ever simple and every decision has both spiritual and political consequences. Part 2, The Noble's Dilemma, Lord of Your Own Disaster. Chapter 3, Congratulations, you're a duke. Your life is now complicated. All right, so being king sounds terrible. Constant paranoia, endless negotiations, everybody wanting to kill you. Hard pass, right? So let's go down a level. Let's talk about being a noble. A duke, maybe, or a count, or a powerful baron. You've got your own lands, your own castle, your own army of knights. You're not dealing with the whole kingdom's problems, just your own territory. This should be way more manageable, right? Wrong. So incredibly wrong. Here's what you need to understand. Being a medieval noble means you're squeezed from above and below. Simultaneously, the king above you keeps demanding things: military service, taxes, political support, attendance at court. The nobles and knights below you keep pushing back against your authority, testing boundaries, trying to expand their own power at your expense. And your peasants? They're not the passive, obedient workforce you might imagine. They've got rights, customs, and a surprising willingness to make your life difficult if you cross certain lines. You're also stuck in the middle of a constant territorial struggle. Your neighboring nobles are eyeing your lands. They're looking for any excuse to claim that disputed border territory, that valuable forest, that river crossing. They're watching for signs of weakness. If you seem vulnerable, maybe you're young, maybe you just inherited and don't have your father's reputation. Maybe you're distracted by other problems. They'll pounce. Medieval politics at the noble level is basically Game of Thrones, except everyone lives closer together and nobody has dragons. Let's start with your relationship with the king, because this defines a huge part of your existence. You're the king's vassal. At some point, probably when you inherited your title, you knelt before the king, placed your hands between his hands, and swore an oath of fealty. You promised to be his loyal subject, to provide military service, to give counsel when requested, to pay certain dues. In exchange, the king granted you your lands and titles, promised to protect you, and confirmed your rights and privileges. This sounds straightforward, but it's incredibly complicated in practice. How much military service do you owe? The standard is usually about 40 days per year, but there are endless arguments about exactly what this means. Does it include travel time to and from the battlefield? Do you have to serve outside the kingdom? What if the campaign lasts longer than 40 days? Are you obligated to stay, or can you go home? What size? Force are you required to bring? Just yourself, or yourself plus a certain number of knights? These questions matter because military service is expensive. You have to equip yourself with armor, weapons, and horses, all costly. You have to bring your own knights and men-at-arms, which means paying for their equipment and supplies. You have to transport everyone to wherever the king is fighting. You're losing income because you're not at home managing your estates. A single military campaign can cost you thousands of pounds, which is a fortune in medieval terms. So when the king summons you to fight, you're immediately doing calculations. Is this a legitimate summons under your feudal obligations, or is the king overreaching? Can you afford this campaign right now? What happens if you refuse? Will the king punish you, or will he let it slide? What are the other nobles doing? Are they all complying, or are some of them making excuses? If everyone else is going, and you stay home, you'll look disloyal and weak. But if nobody else is going and you go alone, you're wasting resources and supporting an unpopular royal policy. And here's the thing, the king needs you, but you also need the king. You need royal backing for your authority. When you have a dispute with another noble, you want the king to support your claim. When you're threatened by enemies, you want royal protection. When you want to expand your territory or gain new privileges, you need royal approval. So you can't just ignore royal summons completely. You have to maintain at least the appearance of loyalty. This creates a constant negotiation. The king asks for military service. You show up, but maybe with fewer troops than requested, claiming that's all you can afford. Or you send your son or a deputy instead of going yourself. Or you go, but you privately negotiate with the king about getting something in return. Maybe a reduction in taxes, or royal support for your claim to a disputed territory, or a marriage alliance between your families. You're playing a complex game where you're trying to minimize your obligations while maximizing your benefits. all while maintaining the relationship you need with the king. Too little compliance, and you're a disloyal vassal who might face punishment. Too much compliance, and you're wasting resources and letting the king exploit you. Now let's talk about your own vassals, because they're doing exactly the same thing to you that you're doing to the king. You've got knights who hold land from you. You've got lesser nobles who swore fealty to you. They owe you military service. They owe you certain payments. They're supposed to support you politically. Whether they actually do this depends on your relationship with them and how much leverage you have. If you're a powerful duke with a fearsome reputation and a strong army, your vassals probably comply with your demands. If you're weak or distracted or young, they start ignoring you. They'll make excuses about why they can't provide military service right now. They'll delay payments. They'll start making independent decisions without consulting you. And you face the same dilemma with them that the king faces with you. You need them. They control territory within your duchy. They provide the military forces you rely on. They administer local justice and collect local revenues. If they all turn against you, you're in serious trouble. So you can't just punish disobedience harshly. You have to negotiate, compromise, maintain relationships. This means you're constantly granting favors to keep your vassals happy. Sir William wants you to support his son's claim to an inheritance. You do it, and now Sir William owes you. Lord Robert is having a dispute with Lord Thomas over a piece of land. You mediate the dispute in a way that keeps both of them reasonably satisfied, or at least not angry enough to cause problems. You're arranging marriages between your vassals' children to strengthen alliances within your territory. You're inviting them to feasts and tournaments to build personal relationships. You're showing up when their children are born or when family members die, because these personal touches matter for loyalty. You're also watching them carefully for signs of disloyalty. Is Lord Richard getting too friendly with the neighboring duke who's your rival? Is Sir John building up his military forces beyond what seems necessary for defending his own lands? Is anyone plotting against you? Medieval nobles absolutely plotted against their lords. If they thought they could get away with it, if they thought another lord would be more favorable to their interests, if they were ambitious and saw an opportunity, they'd switch sides, rebel, or even try to murder you and take your position. So you're gathering intelligence. Your servants are watching their servants. You're paying attention to who's meeting with whom. You're trying to detect conspiracies before they mature. And when you do detect problems, you have to decide how to respond. Sometimes a show of force is necessary. You punish a disloyal vassal publicly to deter others. Sometimes quiet negotiation works better. You meet privately, address their grievances, and bring them back into the fold. Managing your vassals is a full-time job, and it's exhausting. They're not obedient subordinates. They're semi-independent power centers with their own interests, their own resources, and their own capacity for causing you problems. You're not really ruling them. You're managing a coalition of ambitious people who could turn on you at any moment. Let's talk about your actual territory, because understanding medieval estate management helps explain why nobles were constantly stressed about money. You'd think being a duke means you're rich, right? You've got thousands of acres of land, multiple castles, villages full of peasants working for you. You should be swimming in money. Except medieval economies didn't work like that. Most wealth was in land and agricultural production, not cash. Your income comes primarily from your estates, peasants farming your land and paying you in crops, labor, or money. But this income is seasonal, unpredictable, and often insufficient for your needs. Harvest time brings in revenue. Your peasants owe you a portion of what they produce, maybe a third of their grain, maybe specific amounts of chickens and eggs, maybe days of labor on your domain, the land you farm directly. This sounds like a lot, and in a good year it might be enough to support your household and have some surplus to sell. But bad harvests happen. Medieval agriculture was vulnerable to weather, disease, pests, and warfare. One bad growing season and your income drops dramatically. Your peasants can't pay what they owe because they didn't produce enough. You can try to force them to pay anyway, but if you push too hard, They might flee to another lord's territory or die of starvation. Either way, you've lost your labor force, and your expenses are constant regardless of your income. You've got a household to maintain, family, servants, guards, officials, all needing to be fed and paid. You've got castles to maintain, and medieval castles were expensive. Stone walls needed repair, roofs leaked, wooden structures rotted, and needed replacement. Hiring skilled workers for repairs cost serious money. You've got military obligations that required maintaining equipment. Armor wore out. Horses needed to be replaced. Weapons needed maintenance. You needed to keep a certain number of armed men in your service year-round, which meant paying them wages or granting them land. You've got social obligations that required lavish spending. When important visitors came, you had to host them in style or risk looking weak and poor. Feasts needed to be elaborate with expensive food and entertainment. Tournaments required prizes and organization costs. Clothing had to be expensive and fashionable because your appearance communicated your status. You've got religious obligations, donations to churches and monasteries, funding for church building projects, support for clergy. Being perceived as pious was important for your reputation, and piety required spending money on religious causes. All of this meant that even wealthy nobles were often short on cash. They had assets, but poor liquidity. They might control vast territories, but struggle to pay for immediate expenses. This is why nobles were constantly borrowing money from merchants, Jewish moneylenders, or Italian banking families. And debt was dangerous. If you couldn't pay your debts, creditors might appeal to the king to force payment. You might have to sell or mortgage some of your lands, reducing your long-term income. You might lose political influence because everyone knew you were financially weak. Some nobles managed their estates brilliantly, maximized their revenues, invested wisely, and died wealthy. Others made poor decisions, spent beyond their means, got trapped in debt, and ended up losing their lands. The difference between successful and unsuccessful nobles often came down to financial management as much as military prowess or political skill. Now let's talk about private warfare, because this was a constant feature of noble life, and it's completely alien to modern political systems. In the medieval period, nobles could legally wage war on each other to settle disputes. This wasn't crime or rebellion. It was an accepted method of conflict resolution. Say you and the neighboring duke both claim ownership of a valuable piece of forest. You both have documents supporting your claim. You both have witnesses swearing to your rights. The king is far away or distracted or doesn't care about this relatively minor dispute. What do? You go to war. Not a massive war with thousands of troops. Usually more like armed raids and small-scale battles. You send your knights to occupy the disputed territory. Your rival does the same. Your forces clash. People die, property gets destroyed, and eventually someone wins, or you both get exhausted and negotiate a settlement. This happened constantly throughout medieval Europe. Nobles fought over borders, inheritance rights, commercial privileges, insults to honor, and sometimes just because they didn't like each other. These private wars were usually limited in scale. Neither side wanted total destruction, but they were deadly serious to the participants. The problem is that private warfare was expensive and disruptive. Every battle risked losing valuable knights. Campaigns cost money you probably didn't have. Your peasants got caught in the fighting, which disrupted agricultural production and reduced your income. Enemy forces might burn your villages or steal your livestock in raids, and there was always the risk that a private war spiraled out of control. Your rival calls in his allies. You call in yours. Suddenly a dispute over one forest involves 6 different nobles and their forces, ravaging the countryside and creating chaos. The king might step in and punish everyone involved for disturbing the peace. Or the king might ignore it, leaving you to fight it out. Some kings tried to limit private warfare through proclamations of peace of God or truce of God, decrees that fighting was forbidden during certain periods or in certain places. These worked sometimes, but were often ignored when nobles had serious grievances. You had to maintain a military force capable of waging these private wars and defending your territory. This meant keeping knights in your service, maintaining castles that could withstand siege, having weapons and armor ready, training your men for combat. All expensive, all time-consuming, all necessary for survival in the competitive world of medieval nobility. Your castle wasn't just a residence. It was a military installation. The massive walls, the defensive towers, the moat, the drawbridge, these weren't decorative. They were designed to protect you from very real threats. Your neighboring nobles might attack. Bandits might raid. During civil wars or succession crises, armies might march through your territory. Living in a castle was like living in a fortified compound. Yes, you had luxuries that peasants didn't. Fine furniture, expensive tapestries, good food, servants attending to your needs. But you also lived surrounded by armed men, behind thick walls, always aware that you might come under attack. Castle life was also cold, damp, and uncomfortable by modern standards. Stone walls held in moisture. Fireplaces provided some heat, but mostly just heated the immediate area around them. In winter, castles were freezing. You wore multiple layers of clothing, huddled near fires, and still felt cold constantly. Privacy was limited. Your household was large, and most rooms served multiple purposes. People slept in the Great Hall. Servants came and went constantly. Even in your private chambers, you were rarely alone. Servants, guards, or family members were usually present, and castles required constant maintenance. Stone walls developed cracks. Water damaged foundations. Wooden structures within the castle. Floors, roofs, interior walls, rotted and needed replacement. You were always spending money on repairs, and if you neglected maintenance, your supposedly impregnable fortress became vulnerable. Let's talk about justice and law enforcement, because as a noble, you're responsible for administering justice within your territory. You hold court, not the royal court, but a local court, where your subjects bring disputes for resolution. This was serious business, and one of your primary responsibilities as a lord. Your court handled all sorts of cases: property disputes between peasants, contract, disagreements between merchants, criminal cases, theft, assault, sometimes murder, violations of local customs or regulations. People came to your court expecting justice, and your ability to provide fair and effective justice affected your reputation and authority. You weren't a trained lawyer. You probably had some basic education in customary law, but mostly you relied on advisors and local legal traditions. Each region had its own customs about property rights, inheritance, contracts, and criminal punishment. You were supposed to know these customs and apply them fairly. This was harder than it sounds. Customs were often oral tradition, not written law. Different people might have different memories about what the customs actually said. Precedent mattered, how similar cases were decided in the past, but records were incomplete. You had to make judgments based on partial information, conflicting testimony, and vague rules. And your decisions had real consequences. Rule incorrectly in a property dispute, and you might create a blood feud between families that lasts 4 generations. Be too harsh in punishing crimes, and you might be seen as a tyrant. Be too lenient, and crime increases because people don't fear punishment. You also had to enforce your judgments. If you ordered someone to return stolen property and they refused, you needed the capability to compel compliance. This usually meant sending your armed men to seize the property by force. If you lacked the force to back up your rulings, your court became meaningless, and your authority eroded. Criminal justice was particularly complex. For serious crimes like murder, you might sentence someone to death by hanging. This was a public spectacle. Executions happened in front of crowds to demonstrate that justice was being done and to deter others from similar crimes. For lesser crimes, punishments varied. Fines were common. You pay compensation to the victim or to the court. Corporal punishment was used: whipping, branding, cutting off hands or ears for theft. Exile from your territory was another option for people who were problematic but didn't deserve death. You had to balance justice with political considerations. If the accused was connected to powerful families, you had to be careful. punish them too harshly, and you might make enemies of their relatives. Too leniently, and everyone thinks you're corrupt or weak. Trial procedures were nothing like modern courts. There were no lawyers arguing cases. Evidence standards were different. In many cases, trial by combat was an option. Two parties fought, and whoever won was considered to have truth on their side because God wouldn't let the guilty party win. This sounds insane, but it was accepted legal procedure. Someone accused of a crime could demand trial by combat, and you had to allow it. Trial by ordeal was another option, especially in earlier medieval periods. The accused might be forced to carry hot iron or plunge their hand into boiling water. If the wound healed cleanly within a few days, they were innocent. If it became infected, they were guilty. Again, the logic was that God would protect the innocent through miraculous healing. These procedures gradually declined as the medieval period progressed and more rational legal procedures developed. But for much of the Middle Ages, justice combined practical investigation with appeals to divine judgment in ways that seem bizarre today. Your role as judge was exhausting and morally weighty. People's lives, property, and reputations depended on your decisions. Make good judgments, and you earned a reputation for wisdom and fairness. Make bad judgments, and you were seen as incompetent or corrupt. There was no appeals process in most cases. Your decision was final, unless someone appealed to a higher authority like the king. Let's talk about your relationship with the church, because this is another constant source of complexity in your life. The church owned massive amounts of land within your territory. Monasteries, abbeys, cathedral chapters, all held estates that were theoretically exempt from your secular authority. These church lands created all sorts of problems. Church estates didn't provide military service. They didn't pay secular taxes. They were subject to church law, not your law. If a serf on church land committed a crime and fled to another church property, you couldn't legally pursue him because church property had sanctuary rights. This meant that a significant portion of your territory was effectively outside your control. You couldn't tax it, couldn't demand military service from it, couldn't always enforce your legal judgments on it. This reduced your power and income. You also had to deal with church officials who often had their own political agendas. The local bishop might be from a powerful noble family and might use his religious position to advance family interests. Monasteries might claim ancient rights and privileges that conflicted with what you believed were your rights. Disputes with church institutions were tricky because attacking the church risked being labeled impious or even excommunicated. On the other hand, you needed the church. You needed clergy to perform religious services for your household. You needed church support to legitimize your rule. Having the bishop attend your ceremonies and bless your authority helped establish your position. You needed monasteries to pray for your soul and your family's souls. Medieval people believed in heaven and hell, and you wanted those prayers, so you donated to churches and monasteries. You funded building projects. You granted them land and privileges. This was partly genuine piety. You believed this would help your chances of salvation. It was also political. Demonstrating your devotion enhanced your reputation and created obligations from church institutions, but you also competed with the church for resources and authority. When bishops claimed jurisdiction over cases you thought belonged in secular courts, you pushed back. When monasteries claimed tax exemptions you thought were unjustified, you challenged them. The relationship with the church was simultaneously cooperative and adversarial. Some nobles had excellent relationships with church institutions and used them as allies. Others were constantly fighting with bishops and abbots over rights and privileges. Your personal religious convictions, your political situation, and your financial needs all affected how you navigated this relationship. Chapter 4. The daily grind of noble life. It's not what you think. Let's get into what your actual daily life looks like as a noble, because the reality was very different from the romantic, medieval fantasies people imagine. You wake up early. Medieval people generally followed natural light. Up at dawn, sleep at dusk. Your chamber is cold. Because it's winter, and heating a stone castle is nearly impossible. Servants bring you water to wash your face and hands. You get dressed with help from your chamberlain or personal servants. What you wear matters. You need to project status and authority, so even casual dress for you involves expensive fabrics and careful attention to appearance. You attend morning mass in your chapel. This isn't optional. You're expected to be pious, and starting the day with prayer is standard for your social class. The chaplain conducts the service. You pray for your family, your lands, your people, and yourself. Religion isn't just social performance. You probably actually believe that skipping daily mass risks your immortal soul. After mass comes breakfast, though this was usually a light meal in medieval times. The main meal was dinner in late morning or early afternoon. You might have bread, cheese, and ale while discussing the day's business with your steward. Your steward is one of your most important officials. He manages your estates, oversees your revenues, handles administrative matters. Every morning, he updates you on current issues. The harvest in your eastern manor is proceeding well. The mill in another village needs repairs. Rent payments from some tenants are overdue. There's a dispute between two peasants over grazing rights that needs your attention. You make decisions about these matters. Approve the mill repairs. Send someone to collect the overdue rents. Schedule a court session to hear the grazing rights dispute. Medieval estate management involved constant small decisions, and neglecting them led to bigger problems. Then you might tour your castle or your nearby estates. You inspect the walls and fortifications. You check on livestock. You visit fields to see how crops are growing. This isn't just curiosity. You need to know what's happening on your lands. Are your officials doing their jobs properly? Are there problems that need addressing? Is anyone stealing from you? Your presence on these tours also matters politically. Your peasants and servants need to see you, to be reminded that you're watching. Absentee lords, nobles who spent all their time at court or on other estates and never visited, often had their lands poorly managed because local officials knew they could get away with corruption. You hold court, hearing cases and issuing judgments. This might take hours. Cases range from trivial to serious. Two men arguing about a boundary marker between their fields. A woman claiming her neighbor's pigs destroyed her vegetable garden. A serious case of assault. You listen to testimony. Consult with advisors who know local customs and make rulings. This is tedious work. Most cases aren't dramatic or interesting. They're mundane disputes that nonetheless matter greatly to the people involved. You have to pay attention, ask questions, and make fair decisions even when you'd rather be doing something else. Dinner is an early afternoon and is a major event. Your great hall fills with people, your family, your household officials, your knights, your servants. The seating arrangement reflects social hierarchy. You sit at the high table with your family and most important household members. Everyone else is arranged by rank. The food varies based on what's available and your wealth. In a prosperous time, you might have multiple courses, several types of meat, beef, pork, poultry, game, fish on fast days, bread, vegetables, elaborate dishes with expensive spices. In harder times, the meals are simpler, but there's always enough to feed everyone in your household, which could easily be 100 people or more. You're not relaxing during dinner. You're working. You're talking with your knights about military matters. You're discussing estate business with your officials. You're mediating small disputes. You're bonding with your household through shared meals and conversation. Afternoons might bring various activities. Military training was important. You needed to maintain your combat skills. You might practice sword fighting, jousting, or other martial arts. Medieval nobles were expected to be warriors, and you couldn't let your skills deteriorate. You might go hunting. This was recreation, but also practical. Hunting provided meat for your table. It demonstrated your exclusive rights to game in your forests. It was good exercise and maintained your riding and tracking skills. You might handle more administrative work, more meetings with officials, more decisions about estate management, reading letters from other nobles, from the king, from church officials, dictating responses to your clerks. You might receive visitors, other nobles passing through your territory, merchants wanting to discuss trade privileges, church officials on various business. Every visitor required appropriate hospitality, which meant more time, attention, and expense. Evenings brought supper, another communal meal, though usually lighter than dinner. Then perhaps entertainment, music, storytelling, games like chess or backgammon. Your household socialized together. Personal relationships mattered for maintaining loyalty and morale. You might spend time with your family. Your wife managed the household and needed consultation on various matters. Your children needed attention, teaching your sons about their future responsibilities, ensuring your daughters were educated appropriately for their social position. Eventually, you retire to your chambers. You might have a final meeting with close advisors about sensitive matters, then sleep, preparing to do it all again tomorrow. This routine varied, of course. Some days brought disruption, a summons from the king requiring you to travel to court, news of a dispute with a neighboring noble requiring military action, a crisis on one of your estates requiring immediate attention, religious festivals that required your participation, weddings, funerals, tournaments, but the general pattern was consistent: constant work, constant decision-making, constant attention to the complex web of relationships and responsibilities that defined noble life. You weren't living a life of leisure. You were working constantly to maintain your position, manage your resources, and navigate the endless political complications of your world. And you were always aware that failure had serious consequences. Manage your estates poorly, and you went into debt. Lose political conflicts, and you lost land, power, or even your life. Make enemies carelessly, and you might face rebellion or assassination. Medieval noble life was comfortable compared to being a peasant, but it came with relentless pressure and constant risk. Let's talk about women in noble life, because female nobles had complex and often powerful roles that get overlooked. If you're a noblewoman, a duchess, countess, or baroness, your life is simultaneously constrained and influential in ways that are fascinating and contradictory. Legally and theoretically, you're subordinate to men. Your father controlled you until marriage, then your husband controls you. You can't hold certain offices. You can't normally fight in battles. Medieval political theory largely assumes you're passive and powerless. In practice, you often wielded enormous power. When your husband went to war or traveled to court or was captured and held for ransom, you ran his estates. You made administrative decisions, managed revenues, held court, commanded the garrison defending your castle. Some noblewomen did this for years, while their husbands were absent on crusades or imprisoned. You also controlled significant resources through your dower, property settled on you at marriage that you controlled even after your husband's death. This gave you economic independence and political leverage. Powerful noblewomen used their dower lands to build their own networks of supporters and pursue their own political agendas. You arranged marriages for your children, which was serious political work. A good marriage alliance could strengthen your family's position enormously. You negotiated terms, handled diplomacy with other noble families, and used these marriages to build political coalitions. You managed household logistics, which sounds domestic but was actually crucial. The household was a political entity, a center of power. Managing it effectively, ensuring everyone was paid, fed, and loyal, required serious administrative and political skill. Some noblewomen went further and exercised overt political power. Eleanor of Aquitaine was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, Queen of France through her first marriage, Queen of England through her second marriage, and a major political player throughout her life. She led a crusade, rebelled against her husband, ruled England as regent, and was imprisoned for years for her political activities. She wasn't exceptional in having power. She was exceptional in how effectively she used it. Matilda of Tuscany ruled significant territories in Italy, commanded armies, and was a major player in the investiture controversy between popes and emperors. Blanche of Castile served as regent of France and effectively ruled the kingdom for years. Dozens of other noblewomen exercised similar power in their contexts. But this power was always complicated by gender. You had to be careful about how you exercised authority. Too assertive, and you were labeled unfeminine, ambitious, and dangerous. Too passive, and you were weak and ineffective. You had to navigate constant sexism while actually getting things done. You also faced unique vulnerabilities. Marriage was political, not romantic. You were married off to serve family interests, possibly to someone much older or someone you disliked. You had limited options for ending bad marriages. Domestic violence was common and often went unpunished because husbands had legal authority over wives. Childbirth was dangerous. Maternal mortality rates were high. You might have 10 pregnancies and lose half your children to childhood diseases. Every pregnancy risked your life, yet producing heirs was your primary duty. Despite these constraints, many noble women found ways to exercise power, pursue their interests, and shape political outcomes. They worked within the system's constraints while pushing boundaries where possible. They used informal influence when formal authority was denied them. They built networks and alliances that gave them practical power, even when legal power was limited. Your role as a noble woman was complex and demanding. You had to manage households, raise children, handle estate business during your husband's absences, navigate court politics, maintain religious observances, and do all of this while conforming to social expectations about feminine behavior. It required intelligence, political skill, and determination. Some women thrived in this role. Others were crushed by its demands and constraints, but the idea that medieval noblewomen were uniformly powerless is simply false. They had different opportunities and faced different obstacles than men, but many exercised real power and left significant historical marks. Part 3. The Church, the Merchants, and the Final Verdict. Chapter 5. The Church, Spiritual Power, Meets Political Reality. All right, so we've covered kings and nobles. Now let's talk about the Church, because this is where medieval power gets really weird. The Church theoretically rejected worldly power and wealth. Jesus said his kingdom was not of this world. The apostles were poor. Christianity praised humility and condemned ambition. And yet the medieval church became one of the most powerful political institutions in Europe, controlling massive wealth, commanding armies, and making or breaking kings. How did this happen? How did an institution theoretically devoted to spiritual matters become a major political player? And what was it like to actually be a church official navigating this contradiction? Let's start with you as a bishop. Maybe you're the bishop of a major city. Paris, Canterbury, Cologne, somewhere significant. You got this position through a complex process involving church politics, royal influence, noble connections, and possibly some bribery. The exact mix varied, but becoming a bishop was never just about religious devotion. It was about power. Your position is bizarre because you're simultaneously a spiritual leader and a political figure. Spiritually, you're responsible for the souls of everyone in your diocese. You oversee priests, monks, and nuns. You perform sacred ceremonies. You're supposed to lead people to salvation. This is serious business to medieval people who genuinely believed in heaven and hell. But you're also a political figure. Your bishopric owns massive amounts of land. You have revenues from these estates. You might have your own army. You have jurisdiction over church courts that handle certain types of cases. You're a power broker whose support matters to kings and nobles. This creates constant contradictions. You're supposed to be humble, but you need to project authority to be effective politically. You're supposed to reject worldly wealth, but you need money to maintain your position and support your diocese. You're supposed to focus on spiritual matters, but you're constantly involved in political conflicts. Your relationship with the king is particularly complicated. In theory, the church is independent of secular authority. The king has no power over spiritual matters. In practice, kings often controlled who became bishop, and bishops often served as royal officials. Why would kings want to appoint bishops? Because bishops were educated, literate, and administratively competent. In an era when most nobles couldn't read, bishops and other clergy were among the few people with the skills to run government bureaucracies. Kings used bishops as chancellors, treasurers, and administrators. This created conflicts. If you're the bishop, but also the king's chancellor, who are you really serving? When the king's interests conflict with the church's interests, which loyalty wins? Medieval bishops constantly navigated this tension, trying to serve both God and king without betraying either. The investiture controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries was basically a massive fight over this question. Should kings appoint bishops, or should the church control its own appointments? It sounds like an arcane religious dispute, but it was really about power. Whoever controlled bishop appointments controlled enormous wealth and political influence. The conflict between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV illustrates how intense this got. Gregory declared that secular rulers couldn't appoint bishops. Henry, who had been appointing bishops throughout his empire, refused to comply. Gregory excommunicated Henry. Henry's nobles started rebelling, using the excommunication as justification. Henry had to travel to Canossa in winter, stand barefoot in the snow for 3 days, and beg the Pope for forgiveness. This is insane. The Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful secular ruler in Europe, humiliated himself before the Pope because spiritual authority trumped secular power. Gregory lifted the excommunication, Henry went back to Germany, and then the whole conflict continued for decades, with armies fighting and competing popes being appointed. It wasn't resolved until the Concordat of Worms in 1122, which created a compromise that satisfied nobody completely. As a bishop caught in these conflicts, your life was incredibly stressful. You needed royal support to maintain your political position. You needed papal support to maintain your spiritual legitimacy. Sometimes these aligned, sometimes they directly contradicted each other, and you had to navigate carefully. You also ran church courts, which had jurisdiction over certain types of cases. Any case involving clergy was tried in church courts, not secular courts. Marriage cases were church jurisdiction. Wills and inheritance involving church property. Moral crimes like adultery, blasphemy, or heresy. This gave you real power. A nobleman accused of adultery could be tried in your court and punished, maybe required to do penance, maybe fined, maybe excommunicated. Excommunication was serious. It meant you were cut off from the church, couldn't receive sacraments, and were in danger of hell. For medieval people who believed in these things, excommunication was terrifying. You could also place entire regions under interdict, basically shutting down church services in that area. No masses, no marriages, no Christian burials. This was a weapon used against disobedient rulers. When King John of England fought with Pope Innocent III, England was placed under interdict for 6 years. The population suffered, blamed John, and this contributed to his political problems. But using these spiritual weapons for political purposes was ethically questionable. You were supposed to care about souls, not use spiritual penalties as political leverage. Medieval bishops wrestled with this. Some used their power ruthlessly for political gain. Others tried to be more principled and paid political costs for it. Your diocese also owned land, probably a lot of it. Wealthy people donated land to the church for their soul's salvation. Over centuries, this accumulated into massive church land holdings. You administered these estates, collected revenues, and used the income to support your cathedral, pay clergy, fund charitable works, and maintain your own household. Managing these estates was just like noble estate management, dealing with tenants, collecting rents, maintaining buildings, resolving disputes. You had stewards and officials. Handling daily operations, but ultimate responsibility was yours. You also had to deal with monasteries in your diocese. These were theoretically under your authority, but many monasteries had special privileges that made them practically independent. Some answered directly to the Pope, not to you. Some had ancient charters guaranteeing their autonomy. Getting monasteries to comply with your directives was often impossible. And monasteries were powerful institutions in their own right. Major abbeys like Cluny or Citeaux had extensive land holdings, economic resources, and political influence. Abbots of important monasteries were major political figures who negotiated directly with kings and popes, often ignoring local bishops entirely. Your relationship with monasteries ranged from cooperative to hostile depending on circumstances. Sometimes you worked together on shared goals. Sometimes you fought over jurisdiction, revenues, or authority. Either way, monasteries were another complication in your already complicated life. Let's talk about the daily reality of being a bishop, because it was exhausting. You woke early for morning prayers. Religious observance was non-negotiable. You were supposed to set an example of piety. You attended multiple services throughout the day, every day, always. You handled administrative business, meetings with your cathedral chapter, the clergy who assisted in running the diocese, decisions about diocesan matters, correspondence with other bishops, and with Rome. Medieval church administration generated enormous paperwork. You conducted religious ceremonies, ordaining new priests, consecrating churches, confirming young people, presiding over important masses. These were your core spiritual duties, the reason your position theoretically existed. You heard legal cases in church court, deciding marriage annulments, judging clergy accused of misconduct, handling disputes over church property. This required legal knowledge, political judgment, and lots of time. You managed your estates, meeting with stewards, reviewing accounts, making decisions about property. You needed revenue to support your position, and that meant being an effective estate manager. You dealt with political matters, meetings with the king or his representatives, negotiations with nobles, correspondence with the pope, attending councils where church policy was debated. You were constantly involved in politics, whether you wanted to be or not. You supervised charitable works. The church ran hospitals, orphanages, and programs to feed the poor. You were supposed to ensure these operated effectively and served their intended purposes. All of this while supposedly living a life of spiritual devotion and moral purity. You were supposed to be celibate. You were supposed to be humble. You were supposed to care more about souls than power. The gap between these ideals and the political reality of your position created constant moral tension. Some bishops handled this better than others. Some were genuinely pious and tried to balance spiritual and political duties conscientiously. Others were basically secular politicians who happened to wear religious vestments. Most fell somewhere in between, struggling with the contradictions inherent in their position. Now let's talk about the Pope, because papal power is one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval politics. The Pope was theoretically just the Bishop of Rome, first among equals among bishops. In practice, popes claimed supreme authority over all Christians, including the power to depose kings. How did popes gain this power? Partly through theological arguments about Peter being the rock on which Christ built his church, and popes being Peter's successors. Partly through centuries of accumulating precedents and traditions. Partly through political maneuvering and alliance building. By the High Middle Ages, popes were major political players. They commanded the papal states in Italy, actual territory that popes ruled as secular princes. They collected revenues from throughout Christian Europe. They appointed bishops and abbots. They issued decrees that theoretically bound all Christians. They called crusades and promised spiritual rewards for participation. Powerful popes like Innocent III or Boniface of Utrecht acted like they ruled the world. Innocent III excommunicated King John of England, placed France under interdict, annulled marriages of kings, and interfered in imperial elections. Boniface VIII claimed that papal authority extended to all temporal matters, and that kings were subordinate to popes in everything. But papal power was always contested and often fragile. When Boniface VIII tried to assert authority over Philip IV of France, Philip had him arrested. Boniface died shortly after, possibly from the shock and humiliation. The papacy never fully recovered. It ended up moving to Avignon under French domination for decades. Popes faced constant challenges from secular rulers who resented church interference. They faced challenges from church reformers who thought the papacy was too worldly. They faced challenges from heretical movements that rejected papal authority entirely. They faced challenges from rival popes when church politics produced schisms. The Great Schism of 1378-1417 had multiple people claiming to be pope simultaneously, each backed by different kingdoms. At one point, there were 3 rival popes, all excommunicating each other. The spectacle of competing popes undermined claims of papal spiritual authority and damaged the church's credibility. Being pope meant navigating impossible contradictions. You were supposed to be the spiritual leader of Christianity, focused on salvation and morality, but you were also a temporal ruler of the papal states, involved in Italian politics, making alliances and fighting wars like any secular prince. You couldn't be effective at both roles simultaneously. Political success required actions that compromised spiritual authority, and vice versa. Chapter 6. The Merchants. Money without status. Let's shift to a completely different type of power. Merchant wealth. You're a successful merchant in a major medieval city. Maybe Florence, Venice, Bruges, or London. You're rich, seriously rich. You have more actual cash than most nobles. You own property, you control trade networks, you loan money to kings. But despite your wealth, you're still not considered as important as someone born into nobility. This is the weird thing about merchant power in the Middle Ages. Economic power didn't automatically translate into social or political power the way it might today. Birth mattered more than money. A poor knight from an old, noble family had higher social status than you, even if you could buy his entire estate 10 times over. Why? Because medieval social hierarchy was theoretically based on function, not wealth. Nobles fought to protect society. Clergy prayed for everyone's souls. Peasants worked to feed everyone. Merchants, well, what did merchants actually do that was necessary? They moved goods around and made profit. This wasn't seen as particularly noble or important work. There was also religious suspicion of merchants. Making money from trade seemed morally questionable. The church taught that charging interest was usury, a sin. Merchants who got rich from lending money at interest were doing something technically forbidden by church law. Even merchants who made money through trade rather than lending faced criticism for caring too much about profit and too little about salvation. So you are wealthy, but socially inferior. How do you navigate this? How do you convert economic power into political influence when the system is designed to exclude you? First, you buy your way into the system. You purchase property, which brings some status. You loan money to nobles and kings, which creates obligations and gives you leverage. When the king needs funds for a war and comes to you for a loan, you negotiate favorable terms, maybe trade privileges, maybe tax exemptions, maybe a noble title for your son. You invest in your city's government. Medieval cities often had considerable autonomy, with councils and officials elected by wealthy citizens. You participate in city politics, serve on councils, use your wealth to influence decisions. Within the city, your economic power translates into political power even if you lack status in the broader kingdom. You marry your children strategically. You might marry your daughter to a poor noble, paying a large dowry. This gives her access to noble status and gives that noble family cash they desperately need. Over generations, your family gradually moves up the social hierarchy through these marriage alliances. You engage in conspicuous consumption to display your wealth. You build an impressive house. You wear expensive clothing. You host elaborate feasts. You commission art. You donate to churches and pay for building projects. All of this demonstrates that you're someone important, even if you technically lack noble status. You might purchase a noble title if the king is desperate for money. Kings sometimes sold titles and privileges to raise funds. This was looked down upon by old nobility. You were new money, not true nobility, but it gave you legal status and opportunities denied to mere merchants. Some merchant families succeeded brilliantly at this social climbing. The Medici family in Florence went from merchants and bankers to effectively ruling the city, marrying into royal families, and eventually producing popes. The Fuggers in Germany became so wealthy from banking and trade that they influenced imperial elections and funded wars. But this success required generations of effort and strategic maneuvering. You couldn't just buy your way into nobility immediately. You had to patiently build connections, marry well, invest wisely, and gradually move your family up the social ladder. Your daily life as a merchant was consumed with business. You managed trade operations, sending ships with goods to foreign ports, organizing caravans overland, dealing with pirates and bandits who might steal your goods. You negotiated contracts with suppliers and buyers. You tracked accounts meticulously, recording every transaction. You dealt with different currencies, exchange rates, and banking operations. Medieval Europe had hundreds of different coins, each with different values. Converting between them and avoiding counterfeit coins required expertise. You might work with banking families who handled international transfers through letters of credit rather than physically moving coins. You navigated complex regulations. Different cities had different rules about what could be traded, what taxes were owed, what quality standards applied. Guilds controlled many industries and required membership for anyone practicing certain trades. You had to understand and comply with all of this while trying to maximize profit. You took enormous risks. Ships sank, caravans were robbed, markets changed unpredictably, wars disrupted trade routes. A single bad decision or stroke of bad luck could wipe out years of profits. Some merchants made fortunes, others went bankrupt and ended up in debtor's prison. You also faced resentment and suspicion. Nobles looked down on you as socially inferior. Artisans and workers resented your wealth. The church criticized your profit-seeking. You were essential to the economy. Trade connected regions, distributed goods, and created wealth, but you never got the respect you thought you deserved. This created its own kind of power frustration. You had money, but not status. You had economic influence, but limited political voice. You could loan money to kings, but couldn't command armies or make laws. You were powerful and powerless simultaneously, wealthy, but excluded, essential, but disrespected. Chapter 7: What Medieval Power Actually Meant. So we've covered kings, nobles, bishops, and merchants. We've seen how each type of power worked, what it felt like to wield it, and what limitations and complications it involved. Now let's step back and talk about what all of this reveals about medieval power in general. First, medieval power was performative. You didn't just have authority. You had to constantly demonstrate it through rituals, symbols, and ceremonies. Kings wore crowns and sat on thrones. Nobles built castles and held tournaments. Bishops wore elaborate vestments and presided over magnificent ceremonies. Merchants built impressive houses and wore expensive clothing. All of this theater mattered because power was as much about perception as reality. If you seemed weak, people challenged you. If you seemed powerful, they respected you, even if your actual power was limited. Medieval politics was a constant performance where everyone was trying to project strength, authority, and legitimacy. Second, medieval power was relational. You couldn't rule alone. Kings needed nobles. Nobles needed knights and peasants. Everyone needed the church. Power flowed through networks of obligation, loyalty, and mutual dependence. Your power was measured not just by what you controlled directly, but by how many people would support you when you needed them. This made medieval politics intensely personal. Relationships mattered enormously. A king who built strong personal relationships with his nobles was powerful. A king who alienated his nobles was vulnerable. Face-to-face interactions, marriages, personal favors, displays of loyalty. These weren't just social niceties, they were the infrastructure of power. Third, medieval power was fragile. No matter how powerful you seemed, you could fall quickly. Kings were overthrown. Nobles lost everything in failed rebellions. Bishops were deposed. Merchants went bankrupt. The difference between success and disaster often came down to luck, timing, or a single bad decision. This fragility created constant anxiety. You could never fully relax. Every decision carried risk. Every relationship might turn hostile. Every day brought new threats and challenges. Medieval powerful people lived with enormous stress, and many of them cracked under the pressure. Fourth, medieval power was morally complicated. You were supposed to be just, pious, and honorable, but actually wielding power required making morally questionable decisions constantly. Kings had to execute rebels to maintain order. Nobles had to exploit peasants to fund their military obligations. Bishops had to use spiritual weapons for political purposes. Merchants had to charge interest despite church teachings against usury. Everyone struggled with the gap between how they were supposed to act and what actually maintaining power required. Some people resolved this by being ruthlessly pragmatic. Others were paralyzed by guilt and indecision. Most fell somewhere in between, making compromises and hoping God would forgive them. Fifth, medieval power came with crushing responsibility. If you were king and made bad decisions, the entire kingdom suffered. If you were a noble and failed to protect your territory, your people were raped and killed by invading armies. If you were a bishop and failed in your duties, souls were endangered. The stakes were always high, and failure hurt other people, not just yourself. This weight of responsibility aged people prematurely. Medieval rulers often looked decades older than their actual age. The stress, the pressure, the moral burden. It all took a physical and psychological toll. Sixth, medieval power was gendered, but not as absolutely as you might think. Women theoretically lacked power, but in practice many wielded enormous influence. They ruled as regents, they managed estates, they arranged politically crucial marriages, they led armies occasionally. They shaped religious institutions. They exercised power through informal channels when formal channels were closed. But women always had to navigate sexism and fight for legitimacy in ways men didn't. Their power was more precarious, more dependent on relationships with men, more easily challenged. Female power holders worked twice as hard for half the recognition, and they knew it. Seventh, medieval power required constant work. There were no vacations, no retirement, no time off. Being king or noble or bishop was a 24/7 job that lasted until you died. Every moment was political. Every interaction mattered. You could never fully let your guard down. The grind of constant decision-making, constant vigilance, constant performance wore people down. By the end of their lives, many medieval power holders were exhausted, cynical, and ready to die. Conclusion: the reality behind the crown. So what was it really like to have power in the Middle Ages? It was complicated, exhausting, dangerous, and nothing like the simple narratives we usually hear. It wasn't sitting on a throne and having everyone obey you. It was endless negotiation with people who had their own power and interests. It was constantly balancing competing demands from above and below. It was navigating impossible contradictions between theory and practice, between what you were supposed to do and what you actually had to do. It wasn't living in luxury while peasants suffered. It was managing complex economic systems while constantly short on cash. It was making brutal decisions about resource allocation, where every choice meant someone suffered. It was bearing responsibility for thousands of people's welfare with limited ability to actually help them. It wasn't having absolute authority. It was projecting the image of authority while knowing your actual power was limited and fragile. It was performing confidence while privately terrified. It was maintaining the fiction of control while reality constantly threatened to spin out of control. Medieval power holders, kings, nobles, bishops, merchants, were trapped in systems that promised them authority but delivered mostly anxiety. They had real power compared to common people. Absolutely. But that power came with crushing burdens, constant threats, impossible contradictions, and relentless pressure. Understanding this doesn't make us feel sorry for medieval kings and nobles. They still had privileges and advantages that ordinary people lacked, but it does complicate the picture. Medieval power wasn't simple oppression by the strong over the weak. It was a complex web of relationships, obligations, and performances where everyone was constrained by something, where no one had as much control as they seemed to have. The next time you see a movie or read a book about medieval kings and nobles. Remember what we've covered here. Remember the food taster checking for poison. Remember the noble constantly worried about rebellious vassals. Remember the bishop navigating impossible contradictions between spiritual and political duties. Remember the merchant with money but no status. Remember that the crown was heavy, the throne was uncomfortable, and the people wearing them were usually exhausted, anxious, and wondering how long they could maintain the illusion of power before everything fell apart. That's what it was actually like to have power in the Middle Ages, not nearly as fun as it looked.